welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I'm your host, Jessica. I am very excited to welcome back an author who we had on. When did Medusa's Sisters come out?
August 23.
Geez, so it's been like a year. Has it been a year and a half or something to that effect?
It's wild.
Yeah, well, welcome back. We are here to talk with Lauren J. Hebert about Mother of Rome, which is the story of not Romulus and Remus, about their mother, and about Rhea Silvia, the princess who gave birth to them. And it is a really great mythological retelling. It's got a lot of heart, a lot of family stuff in it, and a lot of just perseverance through depression and loss, which is well done in a mythological setting with gods. So I applaud you for that once again.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Oh, I always try to lead with gratitude, and I'm just so grateful to be here again with a second book, talking with you for a second time. And I'm really thrilled about this new story and how it kind of like takes themes that I played with in Medusa's Sisters and expands upon them.
Yeah, I mean, really, like I was taken with these characters right off the first page. I mean, Rhea Silvia, and it's her story, really. I mean, and she is the mother of Rome. She is a princess. She has brothers. Her mom passed away, but her father's the king. And it she has a close relationship with her cousin Antho, which actually I have to say was like a really strong part of this story. One of the things that I loved most about it was that that could have very well been an antagonistic relationship just because of the way that the story goes. And we can get into that a little bit later. But there was, I mean, I think a lot of times when you have these stories, it's easier to make certain rivals versus play on the strengths when women don't let ambition between the two of them get into their way and just sort of see what's really like what's being done. And really both Rhea and Antho were being played as a pawn by Antho's father, who took a weak moment in Rhea's father, the king's life, to really seize power. So I have to applaud that first of all. The two of them were my favorites. I loved reading them. I loved reading them together. I loved reading them apart, even when horrible things had happened. I had hope for them because of just how strong their voices were. And then, it's the story of just how you persevere in the face of things that seem like you have no control over, like ways that you can sort of escape, ways you can make your own escape, ways you can save yourself. So,
Well,
yeah, if you wanted to talk about that a little bit.
absolutely. I mean, you nailed it. I am so much more interested in stories where women find common ground and are loyal and steadfast to each other than I am in stories of female rivalry and women on women violence. Um, I'm really not super interested in like repeating that narrative. And so I am definitely attracted to these kinds of stories because I think that there are a lot of moments in a woman's life where you have to be a strong individual. But part of why I feel like I can be a strong individual is because I have the love and support of such an amazing group of girlfriends. So I think that those two kind of go hand in hand in women achieving agency. And also, a lot of this story is about a super patriarchal world where women have very little control over their bodies, over their choices. And these are two women, both Rhea and her cousin Antho, who fight back in unusual ways. I'm also a little bored sometimes with the narrative where I'm going to make a retelling, but I'm just going to give the girl a sword. It's like almost assigning like kind of like typically masculine qualities to a woman to show that that's how she can succeed in a male's world. And I think there are other interesting ways that women can fight back. And so for Rhea, without giving too many spoilers, it's like she almost embraces like her inner nature, this wild woman within her. And then for Antho, she really learns how to play the game and almost uses the expectations placed upon her as a proper Latin woman, and she uses that to her advantage.
Yeah, and I liked that about them. And they were both very strong without necessarily being warriors, which is always fun to read, but at the same time, it added like some realism to it, which, what might have happened because it did not seem like this was a society. There were some societies in that time period where women were taught to fight along men, or who they were naturally given swords, they were naturally trained, or if they showed the inclination as warriors, but this wasn't one of them. These were princesses.
Exactly. And don't get me wrong, I love me a sword and sandal moment, like who doesn't like it when Mulan picks up her father's sword and joins, the battle against the Huns. I love that moment. I just wanted to do something a little different. And the more I learned about ancient Latium, which is not Rome, right? This is Rome before it's Rome. The more I realized how like really traditional these gender roles were. And Antho's mother, Queen Claudia, she kind of encompasses that of like what a proper Latin woman is supposed to be. And it's very industrious, it's very docile. And these are the two, main characters in my book don't necessarily want to be either of those things.
I wanted to actually talk a little bit. So like after tragedy strikes and Rhea's dad is deposed, they give her to the Vestal Virgins, which is, it's sad because it's almost meant to insult her, to in a way take her power away in a completely different way. Not only her sexuality, but also, her chance to have children, which isn't necessarily necessary in that case, but also makes her less of a threat. If the boys are dead, that's the only worth that the family has. And this almost is meant to humiliate her. Like, in a way, it's a way to stop her from having potential heirs that could supersede any heirs that could challenge her uncle to the throne, but also it's just a humiliation. And then the Vestal Virgins themselves take their station very seriously. And that I found really interesting because they were like at this impasse where Ray is like, I don't want to be here. You don't want me here. And it brings up what you were just talking about, how there were these roles that we would see as traditional, like where um like was basically preserving virginity really that important to the Vestal Virgins? I mean, we think of it very much as a byproduct of Christianity, but this particular group, did you do some research into that?
I did, and I looked, and unfortunately, a lot of the historical references and information I found on the Vestal Virgins are kind of the Vestal Virgins once it became Rome. There isn't much that I could pull from before the Roman, not empire yet, but the Roman like kingdom begins. And there were some very strict rules about sexuality for Roman wives, especially. Yes, your purpose was to produce an heir, but then there were also these other rules, which I kind of touched on in the book about if your husband dies, whether or not you're allowed to have relationships with other men after that. Like it was very, very strict. And I think what Rhea rebels against the most isn't that her dream was always to be a mother, but it was that her choices were being curtailed. And it felt really relevant to be writing this in the political climate we live in, when there are these like institutions that are controlling what you can or can't do with your body.
Yeah, definitely. And I thought that that was really well done. And Rhea was like a sexual being. I mean, that was, like a really big part of who she was in this. How did you go about just sort of adapting the story and all of the characters in it? I know with Medusa's sisters, we don't hear a lot about the other Gorgons and there's certain licenses. In this particular one, how much source material did you have, and how did kind of hammering it out work for you?
I knew I wanted to write about motherhood for the next novel because I had really done a lot with sisterhood, in my first one. And I was brainstorming like images and allusions and references. Like, what do I think of when I think mother? Right. So I had everything from Josephine Rabbit, from Beatrix Potter, to like the Game of Thrones moms, to, Marmee March. And then I had the Capitoline Wolf. I don't know, that just kind of came up in my brainstorming. And the Capitoline Wolf is that image of, the she wolf, the mother wolf nursing twin boys, which we know are Romulus and Remus. And that's a really powerful image because it's a very unsettling, unnatural image, probably the first time you see it, an animal nursing children, but it's also something that we've really kind of accepted into this communal cultural iconography. Like we all know this symbol, we see it in a lot of places, not just in Italy. And so I did a little more perusing of that story. And in a way, it's very similar to Medusa's Sisters, where I found out a lot about Rhea Silvia leading up until she fulfills her purpose. She gives birth to the babies and then she disappears. She kind of just fades out of the narrative. And whenever I see a female character just kind of fade away, it gives me this like, pause moment. Like, where did she go? And that's really kind of what inspired this story was the details I found about her story, which I got from Dionysius of Halicarnassus. It's a mouthful. I mean, every element I was pulling out was like, this is so Shakespearean. This is so biblical. This, like, there were some cool narrative ideas and tropes in this story. So it was fun to play around with that and change things and make her more sexual and give her more agency and make her feel more like a modern woman. And then on top of that, finish the story. What happens to her after the babies are born? Because um, I think that if I had to like summarize what I was trying to do with this book, it's like my homage to mothers, but it's also to the before. It's like to Rome before it was Rome, to Romulus and Remus, like what came before them, what came before the city, what came before the kings. And the answer to all of this is a mother and Rhea Silvia.
Was there anything that you really wanted to include that you really were not able to?
Oh, that's such a good question. This book went through a lot of drafts, because I think I had really big ideas of where it could go. And I will say that in the original draft, I went all the way up to the conflict between Romulus and Remus on the hill, which, for those who don't know, Remus is killed. And there's a couple different versions of how it goes, but I think the most common one is that Romulus kills Remus. It's kind of like a Cain and Abel story. And you might have noticed too, there are these themes of brothers that kind of repeat throughout the story as well. in contrast to these sisterhoods. And so the original draft ended with that, and it just there wasn't like enough of a catharsis. I think it left the reader feeling really unsettled. So instead it ends where it does, with this promise of a new city, but not with the brothers eventually turning on each other. I think that could be an interesting story in itself, but maybe that's not Rhea's story, is what I decided.
I was actually really happy that that wasn't there because I didn't think it was necessary,
Yeah.
I mean, and also not to sound whatever, I mean, that is the myth, but also Rhea's story was such one of strength. I feel like that would have brought it all down. I felt like it really just was a well told story with, as you said, just a lot of good arcs, a lot of stories of bonds and betrayal, and just really good characters. I wanted to just ask one more thing about um, how and when you decided to add gods into the story. Was there ever a point where you wanted to make it a little bit more concrete and not have the deities interact with the human characters?
That's also a great question. I really love the author duo A.D. Rhine, and they write, Trojan War retellings. And what I admire about their books is that they're like almost purely historical fiction. There really isn't the magic and the gods and goddesses coming into that as well. They always make it a more realistic retelling. And there's way more so than Medusa Sisters. I feel like this book kind of crosses genres between historical fiction and fantasy. Um, but I liked keeping elements of fantasy that almost felt more like spec fiction in a way than just full on like magic powers. And there are definitely magical elements that keeps it in that fantasy world that I love so much, and in this mythological world as well. But I liked bridging the two.
It was nice to read as well.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, I in this book, I mean, again, for fear of spoilers, but you could argue that it's a type of werewolf story as well. There's this idea of kind of a reverse werewolf that shows up later in the book, um, which felt kind of speculative as well to me.
So after this, are you heading back into mythology for what you are planning next?
It was nice to step outside of the Greek mythology and kind of explore this other world where it's very similar, but the Roman pantheon that we think of is really a mix of like everything they stole from Greece mixed with what the Latin tribes were already um, worshiping in their world as well. So it's kind of this, potpourri of religions. So that was fun to try something different. But yes, for book three, I'm going back to Greece. It's kind of like a little homecoming. And then from there, I don't know. I mean, I have so many ideas. And I definitely like playing with genre um, and combining genres. That's a definite interest of mine.
Thank you so much. This was absolutely wonderful. I'm really excited to hear what people are thinking about Mother of Rome. It was really good. And it had a lot of elements that I believe we all enjoy. And thank you so much, Lauren, for coming back.
Of course, and hopefully, with this third book, we can have our Third Time's the Charm podcast.
That would be absolutely lovely. Are you able to talk about what the next one is going to be, or is it under wraps at the moment?
I'm not sure actually, so I'm being careful
Yeah, let's
because
not. We'll let it
yeah,
be a secret.
yeah, and get the proverbial slap on the wrist. So I'm being really politician about it, aren't I?
Yes, but that is fair. Absolutely.
Well,
Oh,
if it's one of my books, it's going to have a strong female character, acting in rebellious, resistant ways.
Excited to see who it's going to be.
Thank you.
All right. So this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. My guest today was,
Lauren J.A. Bear.
and we are going to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.